We're going to find out exactly what happened to each of the false gods in the Bible, starting with Dagon. The Philistines were one of Israel's most persistent enemies during the Iron Age. Roughly between 1200 and 600 BC, their supreme deity was Dagon, whom they worshipped as a powerful lord of the earth. He was often depicted as a figure that was a half man and half fish, and the Philistines believed that he was responsible for the success of their crops and the fertility of their land. Because he was so important, they built massive temples for him in cities like Ashdod and Gaza to honor his strength. However, during a war around 1075 BC, the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites. They brought the Ark into Dagon's temple in Ashdod as a victory trophy. But the next morning, the priests found the statue of Dagon lying face down on the floor. They put the statue back, but the following morning it was face down again. This time, Dagon's head and both of his hands had been broken off and were lying by the door. In the ancient world, cutting off the head and hands was how people treated a defeated king, and this event proved that Dagon was powerless in his own temple. Over time, the Philistine civilization was eventually crushed by the Babylonian Empire in 604 BC. Once their cities were destroyed, the worship of Dagon vanished from the region. When the Greeks arrived later, they replaced him with their own gods like Poseidon. Today, Dagon has no followers left and only exists as a monster in scary movies or horror stories where he's seen as a creature instead of a god. Dagon belonged to Israel's enemies, the Philistines, but the next god was created by Israel itself. This event occurred during the Exodus. While Moses was on top of Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments, he was gone for 40 days. The Israelites began to panic because they thought he had died, and they wanted a physical god they could see and follow. They decided to melt their gold jewelry to create a calf statue. This was meant to mimic the Apis bull, a god of strength and fertility that they'd seen while they were slaves in Egypt. When Moses finally came down the mountain and saw the people worshipping the idol, he immediately destroyed it. He burned the statue and ground the gold into a fine powder. Then he mixed that powder with water and forced the people to drink it. This was to prove that their god was not divine, because something that could be swallowed and digested is not a real god. This type of bull worship was briefly revived by King Jeroboam around 930 BC for political reasons, but his altars were eventually wiped out by the Assyrians. Today, archaeologists occasionally find small bull figurines in the ruins of ancient cities like Samaria, but they're mostly broken pieces of metal buried in the trash and dirt. While the golden calf was a physical idol destroyed in the desert, Artemis was the center of a massive industry in one of the world's most famous ancient cities. Around the 1st century AD, the city of Ephesus, located in modern-day Turkey, was home to the Temple of Artemis. This temple was so large and beautiful that it was known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Artemis was worshipped as a queen and a protector of the earth, and her cult was a huge part of the city's identity. Local silversmiths made a living by selling small silver statues of the goddess to tourists and worshippers who traveled from all over the Roman Empire to see her. The downfall of Artemis began when the Apostle Paul arrived in Ephesus, preaching that gods made by human hands weren't actually gods at all. His message was so powerful that people started to change their minds and stopped buying the silver statues, causing the local business to begin to fail. As a silversmith named Demetrius saw his profits vanish, he decided to take a stand. He gathered the other workers and convinced them that Paul wasn't just insulting their goddess, but he was also destroying their very way of life. This talk turned the worried craftsmen into an angry mob that rushed into the city's massive stone theater. For 2 whole hours, thousands of people filled the air with a single shout, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." They were waiting for their goddess to do something, anything, to prove her power and defend her honor. But as the hours passed, Artemis remained silent. No miracle happened to settle the dispute, and eventually, city officials had to step in to calm the crowd and send everyone home. Without a supernatural sign to prove her power, the new faith continued to spread, and the once mighty goddess slowly began to lose her hold on the ancient world. In 268 AD, the Goths invaded Ephesus and plundered the Great Temple. It was never fully rebuilt after that. As the Roman Empire eventually adopted Christianity, the temple was abandoned and people began using its marble to build other buildings and churches. Today, the site of the once magnificent temple is just a swampy field with a single reconstructed column. The goddess who was once worshipped by millions now has no followers, and her temple has been reduced to a pile of stones for tourists to visit. Just as Artemis lost her influence as her city changed, Chemosh was a fierce protector of a kingdom whose name eventually vanished from the map. Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites. a people who lived east of the Dead Sea and were often at war with Israel. During the 9th century BC, the Moabites viewed Chemosh as a war god who gave them victory over their enemies. They believed that whenever they lost a battle, it was because Chemosh was angry with them, so they would perform extreme rituals to win back his favor. So when King Mesha of Moab began losing a desperate battle against a combined army of Israelites and their allies around 850 BC, he took a drastic and final action. To stop the destruction, he took his oldest son and sacrificed him on top of the city wall in full view of the enemy armies. The Bible records that a great indignation or horror swept through the camp of the attackers, causing the combined armies to abandon the siege and go home. Because this moment is so mysterious, it has become one of the most debated events in ancient history. Some believe the Israelite soldiers were simply so haunted by the gruesome sight on the wall that they lost their will to fight. Others suggest that the wrath was a divine judgment against the Israelites for pushing the Moabite king to such desperate, dark extremities. There's even a possibility that this part of the story was influenced by ancient Moabite records designed to make Chemosh look like a powerful savior. Regardless of what happened behind the scenes, the invading army vanished, and for a short time, it seemed as if Chemosh had actually protected his kingdom from total destruction. But this victory did not last forever. As the centuries passed, the Babylonians conquered the Moabite people and then the Persians, and their distinct culture then began to fade. By the time the Romans took control of the region, the name of Chemosh was no longer being invoked in worship. In 1868, a large stone called the Mesha Stele was discovered, which contains an inscription written by the king himself praising Chemosh for his help. This stone is one of the few pieces of evidence we have left of this god's existence, as his worship completely disappeared after the region was Romanized and the Moabite nation ceased to exist. Although Chemosh was a god who seemingly won a temporary victory before disappearing into history, Baal was the most famous rival of all, who ended up being insulted in the most embarrassing way possible. Baal was the storm god of the Canaanites and was worshipped as the Lord of the Rain. During the 9th century BC, many people in Israel began to worship him because they believed he controlled the weather and the success of their crops. Because rain was so important for survival in the dry Middle East, Baal became a very popular god, and his followers built many altars and temples in his honor. Baal's defeat took place on Mount Carmel, where the prophet Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. Each side built an altar and waited for their god to send fire from the sky to light it. The prophets of Baal shouted and even cut themselves for hours, but Baal stayed silent and no fire appeared. Later, a king named Jehu decided to end Baal worship in Israel for good. He tricked all the followers of Baal into gathering at a massive temple in Samaria, and after his soldiers removed them, they tore down the building. To make sure that the site was never used for worship again, they turned the temple into a public latrine, which was the ultimate sign of disrespect. Over time, Baal's name became a joke and a symbol of evil. The title Baal-zebul, which meant the Lord of the Prince, was changed to Baal-zebub, which meant Lord of the Flies. This name eventually turned into Beelzebub, which is a common name used for the devil today. The god who was once feared as the master of the storm ended his story as a demon in ancient history books. The next god on our list, Nisroch, represents a major failure in the heart of the powerful Assyrian Empire. During the 7th century BC, the Assyrians were the most powerful military force in the world. Their king, Sennacherib, was famous for leading a massive campaign against the kingdom of Judah and attempting to capture Jerusalem. According to historical records and the Bible, Sennacherib returned to his capital city of Nineveh after his army suffered a major setback. He went to his god's temple, Nisroch, to pray and seek protection. However, the reputation of Nisroch collapsed during the downfall of Sennacherib around 681 BC. While the king was kneeling in worship inside the temple, his own sons attacked him with swords and killed him. This was a massive scandal because the god Nisroch was supposed to be the protector of the king, yet he couldn't even save his most important follower inside his own holy building. As historians and archaeologists began to study the ruins of Nineveh in more recent times, they discovered something even more interesting about this god. They found that there is no record of a god named Nisroch in any ancient Assyrian writings. Most scholars now believe that the name Nisroch was actually a misspelling by ancient scribes. They think the name was meant to be Nimrod or a similar deity, but because some Hebrew letters look very similar, the name was copied incorrectly over the centuries. This means the god Sennacherib was praying to didn't just fail to save him, his name as we know it only exists because of a typo. Nisroch's identity was lost through historical accident. But Ashtoreth was a global icon who became a massive rival to Israel's faith. Ashtoreth was the goddess of love, beauty, and war. She was worshipped by many different cultures in the Middle East. During the 10th century BC, even the wise King Solomon built high places or outdoor altars for her to please his foreign wives. She was often called the Queen of Heaven, and her worship was very attractive to the common people because it involved festivals and family rituals. In the city of Jerusalem, many families would bake special cakes and pour out drinks to honor her, believing she would bring them peace and good luck. However, Ashtoreth was destroyed when Israel's leaders tried to pull the people back to their original faith. Around 622 BC, King Josiah led a massive reform where he smashed her stone pillars, cut down her sacred groves, and filled her worship sites with human bones to make them unclean. Despite these efforts, many people continued to worship her in secret until the Babylonian conquest of 586 BC. When the Israelites were taken into exile and Jerusalem was destroyed, the Ashtoreth-specific cult was finally broken. Over time, Ashtoreth changed names. As the Greek and Roman empires rose to power, she was absorbed into the characters of Astarte and later Aphrodite. Today, the specific biblical version of Ashtoreth has no temples or followers. She has been reduced to a subject for history books and museum exhibits, where people study her as a symbol of ancient mythology rather than a living goddess. While Ashtoreth was eventually absorbed into Greek mythology, Tammuz is famous for a mourning ritual that was so popular that it was performed right at the gates of the temple in Jerusalem. Tammuz was an ancient Mesopotamian shepherd god whose life was tied directly to the harsh desert seasons. His followers believed that he died every year during the brutal heat of the summer, leaving the earth dry and barren. To ensure he was reborn with the winter rains, the people held an intense yearly ritual where they would weep and mourn for his death. This dramatic practice became incredibly popular and spread far beyond his home country. By the 6th century BC, this ritual had even reached the sacred city of Jerusalem. The prophet Ezekiel recorded a shocking vision of women sitting right at the north gate of the temple, openly crying for a foreign god. The downfall of Tammuz began when a new empire swept through the Middle East. As the Greeks marched in, they brought their own vibrant stories and myths with them. They introduced the locals to Adonis, a young god of beauty and rebirth whose story sounded incredibly familiar. Fascinated by this new character, the people slowly shifted their attention away from the old Mesopotamian shepherd. Grew quiet, the yearly weeping stopped, and the rituals for Tammuz were finally abandoned. Today, the most interesting part of his story is how he's remembered. Tammuz is no longer a god that people cry for, and he has no modern worshippers. However, his name ironically survives as the name of a month in Jewish and Arabic calendars. The god who once commanded the mourning of entire cities ended up being reduced to a simple word for a time of year. Although the name of Tammuz only survived as a month on a calendar, the next gods, Bel and Marduk, were the supreme rulers of the great city of Babylon. In the 6th century BC, Babylon was the center of the world. Its patron god was Marduk, who was often referred to by the title Bel, meaning the Lord. Marduk was believed to be the creator of the universe and the protector of the Babylonian kings. His temple, a massive step pyramid called a ziggurat, rose high above the city and was visible for miles. The people believed that as long as Marduk was happy, Babylon would remain unconquered, and they celebrated him every year with massive festivals and expensive offerings of food. Yet when the Babylonian Empire began to collapse, Bel and Marduk also started to fall down. At around 539 BC, the Persians invaded the city, and their leader, Cyrus the Great, claimed that Marduk had actually switched sides. He told the people that Marduk was so angry with the Babylonian king that he personally invited the Persians to take over the city. This move made the Babylonian god seem like he was working for the enemy. Additionally, in an ancient story from the Book of Daniel, the prophet proved that the statue of Bel wasn't actually alive. He scattered ashes on the floor of the temple to show that it was the priests, not the god, who were sneaking in at night through secret doors to eat the food offerings. Over time, the great temples of Babylon fell into ruin. In 482 BC, after a Babylonian revolt, the Persian king Xerxes is said to have melted down the massive golden statue of Marduk to fund his wars. Today, the site of the once mighty temple is just a pile of mud bricks in the desert of Iraq. The god who was once the king of the gods has no kingdom left. His name is only known by historians who study the rise and fall of ancient empires. Just as Marduk's golden statue was melted down and his temple turned into mud, The final god on our list went from being a terrifying deity of fire to the ultimate symbol of a garbage dump. Molech was the national god of the Ammonites, and his worship was among the most feared in the ancient world. During the 8th and 7th centuries BC, his followers built a site called the Tophet in the valley of Hinnom, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. Molech was a god who demanded the most extreme sacrifice possible, the passing of children through the fire. According to ancient records, the worshippers would beat loud drums to drown out the screams of the infants so that the parents would not be moved by their cries during the ritual. Around 622 BC, King Josiah of Judah led a massive campaign to destroy all idols in the land. When he reached the valley of Hinnom, he defiled the entire area. He commanded that the valley be turned into the city's permanent garbage dump. From that point on, the valley was filled with trash, animal carcasses, and the bodies of executed criminals. To keep the waste from piling up and causing disease, fires were kept burning there constantly, day and night. Because of this, the physical location of Molech's worship became a place of filth and unending fire. By the time of the New Testament, Jesus used the name of the valley, Gehinnom, as the word for Gehenna, which we know today as hell. Molech disappeared as a god, and his legacy was completely transformed. He went from a deity people feared and sacrificed to being the name of a literal trash heap that served as a visual warning of divine judgment.